It's Wednesday, May 29th. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Football Show. It is a hell of a day to talk ball. I hope you all enjoyed your Memorial Day weekend. Took a little extra day off from the pod. I know I sure as hell enjoyed it, even though we got some rain here. But again, hell of a day to talk ball. And joining me to do just that is Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points. Ryan, what's going on, buddy?
Hey, I'm had a great Memorial Day weekend. Very excited to be talking to you, man.
Yes. If you guys are not familiar with Ryan's work over at Fantasy Points, it's absolutely fantastic. You guys know I reference Fantasy Points data here on the site all the time. It's, in my opinion, the best bang for your buck. If you're looking for data, this is not a planned ad for Fantasy Points. Okay. This is a full, wholehearted endorsement. But listen, Ryan's been doing fantastic work over there. Specifically, something I want to highlight on this show, which will be our subject for today. But this is really the first installment of a new kind of mini series here on the podcast. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be diving into data and or trends that are critical to note heading into the 2024 NFL season. The first half of each podcast, we're going to kind of take like a macro look at a specific trend in depth. We're going to pull examples, kind of playing it out from previous seasons, basically like, hey, here's a stat or a data trend. Let's talk about why this really matters when covering football right now. The second half is going to be a little more player specific. We're going to try and identify relevant players that this specific metric or trend can really help us project for 2024. And to be honest with you, Ryan, told you this before the show, your work with first downs per route run was really the reason why I wanted to do this series. It was an excuse just to get you on the pod and break this down, because when I read your piece, which again is up on Fantasy Points website, we'll link to it. It'll be easy for people to find it. I just thought it made so much sense. I do a lot of work on the wide receiver position. I thought this was great stuff. So let's just kick this off here, man. First downs per route run. We in the industry talk a lot about yards per route run, but tell us why this is different and maybe even a little bit better than yards per route run as a receiver metric.
Yeah, so kind of very similarly to yards per route run. First and foremost, first downs per route run is just a measure of a receiver's ability to execute their route, to earn a target, and to convert it into a reception that's going to advance their team's field position. That's really what it comes down to, is good receivers will get first downs more often. So if we just divide first downs by total routes to control for the total volume of opportunities, we're just left with this all-encompassing measure of wide receiver skill and effectiveness. As for why it's different than yards per route run, why are we using first downs instead? Well, the first reason is first downs per route run is actually a little bit more predictive of fantasy points in the following season. So I like to post my Pearson correlations for all the stats I use on Twitter. People can go check that out. But yeah, first downs per route run is a bit more stable from year to year than yards per route run, and it is more predictive of fantasy points per game. It's even more predictive than target share, which to me is like the boilerplate immediate first metric I usually care about for a wide receiver. So yeah, if we're beating that, then we're doing pretty good here. And kind of the reason that I think first downs per route run is very useful, especially in tandem with yards per route run, is it gives you similar but slightly different information. So some players will gain yards in less sustainable ways than others. So we can see players that have a handful of really big plays that will inflate their yards per route run. That's not going to inflate their first downs per route run very much if they're not consistently winning on their routes. So just by comparing the two metrics, we can almost get a stylistic understanding of how this player wins. Is it primarily on big plays, or is it a consistent win on a route to route basis?
And I love that, right? Because a lot of what I'm doing with perception is trying to isolate from surrounding variables like quarterback play and everything like that, and offensive environment, that stuff. Just focus on the receiver winning. But that last sentence you said there, on a consistent route by route basis, is the big thing for me, because And we'll get into the concept of big play merchants. But when I saw you kind of posting about that, and when I got into that in the meat of your article, I was like, this is really what sold me on the metric, because I like yards per route run. Yards per route run is a good stat. It doesn't tell you everything. I don't think any stat, even first downs per route run, which I think is an even better stat, is not going to tell you everything about just purely the wide receiver as an individual. There's things we can parse out there. But like with yards per route run, the biggest thing that I always come back to the Treylon Burks in college example, because when I was talking about Treylon Burks as a prospect, my biggest concern with him, Ryan, was that he was not good against press coverage. The immediate blowback you'd get from people was, well, look at his yards per route run against press coverage. I'm like, I want you to go watch those. It was a small sample too. So I want you to go watch all of those. And I know people can't do this because college film's not that easy to access, but like go see a few of those, like, big plays where Treylon Burks, wins one route against press coverage on a go route, and he catches the ball 20 yards down the field and then makes one defender miss and houses it. Well, that's 70 yards is going into the per route run stuff there. So that, like, being inflated by the big plays is always kind of my concern with some of these players in yards per route run. But before we kind of parse all that out, I do just want to kind of, again, giving people a big overview of this metric. I always like just the sniff test when we're looking at like a newer stat, or we're talking about this, and just like look at who are the best players in this metric. The top 10 players in first downs per route run, minimum 100 routes last year, according to Fantasy Points data: Tyreek Hill, Brandon Ayuk, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins just signed himself a big extension today. Another metric here showing that Nico Collins is a top receiver: Jaylen Waddle, AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, and Rashee Rice, who I know we're going to talk about later in the show. Like, that alone, Ryan, to me, that passes the sniff test if we're talking about like quality receivers. Absolutely,
yeah. And I think that is a super important way whenever you encounter a new metric to kind of go about it. Yeah, who is at the top of it with a reasonable route minimum, and does it seem like this is telling me anything useful? And yeah, as soon as I started playing around with this, it was very clear to me that this was telling us something useful. So we can go into kind of comparing first downs per route run to yards per route run a little bit, because people, if anyone like lives in the spreadsheets as much as I tend to, they might notice those names you just listed off. Okay, a lot of those guys were also guys who did really well in yards per route run. So why do we care about this? And that's true. Yes, the two metrics are highly correlated. Most players who do well in one are going to do pretty well in the other, and vice versa. But what we can really learn is when the two metrics disagree, that's going to tell us something about that. Maybe not about that player, but at least about the season that they just put up that we're looking at. So I kind of broke players out over the past 3 seasons into a few different buckets. So the first bucket was big play merchants, as I named it. So these are players who were significantly better in yards per route run than they were in first downs per route run. So kind of like you're saying there, a lot of the time that is because they make a few big plays that will inflate the yards per route run, but not the first downs per route run. Or I've also noticed that the yards after catch guys will sometimes get put into this bundle. So yeah,
that makes complete sense, by the way, just from like the sniff test part of it that we're talking about. Like, and think about the Treylon Burks example that we just talked about, where like you're that guy. I don't want to just bag on Treylon Burks because, like, my God, he's like the Titans' 4th receiver or whatever, but I'm going to keep doing it anyways. Like, in addition to some of that press coverage stuff, a lot of like the ways he got yards was like kind of the Mickey Mouse stuff, some design touches and things like that. And obviously there are some guys that are great receivers that also add yak ability. But I like this way of sort of like differentiating between the two.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the first bucket. That's the big play merchants. After that, we have just normal players. This is most players whose yards per route run ranks fairly similarly to their first downs per route run. And then we have players that are the opposite, where they're much better in first downs per route run than they were in yards per route run. I kind of called this bucket the possession merchants. The idea is they will get the first down frequently, but they're not going to be the guy that's going to turn up the field for another 20 or 30 yards very often. They'll move the chains, and that's about it. So I broke these players into these three buckets: big play merchants, the normal players, and the possession merchants. And I said, okay, what happened the next season for each of these players? And what I found was, for both the normal players and the possession merchants, it was about 50-50 if they were going to be more or less efficient the following season in terms of yards per route run. But for the big play merchants, 85% of them were less efficient by yards per route run in the following season. So there's your Treylon Burks when the route sample increases and we're not getting this variance of these handful of big plays. Okay, first downs per route run predicted somewhat that a big play merchant was at least ranking above where he probably should be in yards per route run based off of whatever it is, whatever unsustainable way he was producing. So whenever we see a player that's a big play merchant, we should be skeptical of their ability to maintain their efficiency in the following season. And that's going to have big implications for certain wide receivers in fantasy football.
Right, because you look back at your original, and this is also in the article, which again, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll definitely link this in the show notes and everything like that. Like if you look at what's correlated or what's predictive of fantasy points in the next year, like the number one thing is first downs, which I actually think, again, speaks to the power of this specific metric we're talking about here. But like some of the things that are very unsustainable is drop rate, ADOT, contested catch rate, yards per reception, missed tackles forced per reception, yak per reception. And a lot of those can be part of being the big play merchant is you're very good at those things, but you're maybe not good at like the consistent fundamentals of wide receiver play, which I mean, like I know from receiver evaluation, they're like, I have a type, right? I definitely have a type in terms of guys I really like. I love the route runners. I love these players who are consistent on the route by route basis. Cause to me, I think if you end up in a good environment, you're a consistent separator. Like the ball's going to find you, opportunity is going to find you. You know, the quarterback's going to like that player. I think over just like the course of reception perception history, for sure, man coverage and being able to separate against man coverage has been like my most powerful predictor because I think this is all sort of correlated. Like I think we probably are going to like a lot of the same players here between this metric and what I do. So specifically sticking on these big play merchants, you mentioned that 85% of them see like a decrease next year. We're going to talk about guys for projecting next year, but like let's look back at the past. Can you think of any examples of players that were these big play merchants that kind of like first downs per route run could have given us a warning sign in previous years?
Yeah, so I swear I'm not bringing up this player to rag on you or anything, but the biggest one that stuck in my mind was actually Rashad Bateman after 2022.
Yeah.
Yep. So had a lot of pretty big plays. It was also a fairly small route sample. He only played a handful of games that year. But his yards per route run that season looked pretty good. And if you're the type of person that's going to sort by yards per route run and say, okay, this is a third-year receiver, I guess this is some breakout potential here. He had a decent per route efficiency. I'm all over this. But with the first downs per route run being significantly worse, then that makes you take a second look and say, okay, well, how was he producing all of these yards? What was he sustainably kind of always moving the chains? Or was this a handful of big plays? So that was just kind of one off the top of my head that I remembered and was like, oh, like that guy totally got me in that year.
Yeah, he's definitely that, like he fits that to a T because yeah, that was a big thing. It's like, oh, in this small sample, he was super efficient, but it was a lot of big plays. It wasn't consistent play for Rashad Bateman. Like he's always a tough player to talk about because he just has barely played, right? But isn't it funny actually though, if you look back at this past year, right, he's actually kind of on the inverse of that, right? Where he's a little bit more like he actually looks better in 23 in terms of first downs per route run than he does in yards per route run, which makes a lot of sense, Ryan, because if you watch him play last year, like you see he's consistently separating, but it's actually the inverse now where like he's not doing anything from a separation standpoint and then therefore a production standpoint down the field. A lot of it is like short and underneath stuff, which if you're having a fantasy conversation for this year, you're like, he's going to need a lot of volume if that's the role he's going to be good at to be good in fantasy. Like he can be good for the Ravens, but not good in fantasy kind of. But it's interesting that like that profile is sort of flipped on its head 1 year after playing like off a significant injury.
Absolutely, yeah. And I do want to say, like, when we categorize, oh, this player is a big play merchant, that's not necessarily an evaluation of what this is just fundamentally what this player is and is always going to be. It's comes down to very often their usage in a particular season. So sometimes that's correlated with the type of player that they are and they should be and the type of role they can be in. But yeah, this isn't, we shouldn't say, oh, well, Jamar Chase was a big play merchant in 2021, therefore I don't like him right now. Like that is not really how this works.
Well, that's where I think it is important to like do this and in conjunction with like watching the players and stuff like that. Because there's a few, when we talk about some of these big play merchants in the second half of the show, there's a few of them where I'm like, yup, that makes a lot of sense. Where it's like, oh, this guy's yards per route run's really high. But like, there's a difference between Nico Collins' yards per route run high and like some of these other players that we're going to talk about, like I said, a little bit later. So the big play merchants, again, I think is a pretty clear warning sign. Like we're saying, it doesn't mean that this is the end all be all and like this is who this guy is going to be forever, but like you better have a reason for like why he can evolve as a player or why his role can evolve on the team. I think those are sometimes two separate questions. Let's talk a little bit about these possession merchants. I think we kind of have a good idea like who we're going to talk about with these big play merchants a little later, but like possession merchants specifically. So again, these are the players, to remind the listener, that who rank significantly better in first downs per route run than yards per route run, at least 10 percentiles higher. Who are some examples of the possession merchants?
From this past year, Michael Pittman was kind of the one that most stuck out to me.
That's perfect.
That made sense to me.
That is the ultimate possession merchant.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that can be fine when it comes to fantasy. I didn't, when I was looking around in terms of what I could predict for possession merchants the following season, there wasn't really anything necessarily there. Like there were some really solid players, there were just some kind of whatever role players, and there were like some disaster players. But just stylistically, Michael Pittman kind of shows up there, and I think he gives a good visual of what it is we're talking about. With him, I mean, it's really just for me. With Michael Pittman in fantasy football, it's just about ceiling. What are you like? Right. Yes, he can command the targets. He always kind of has commanded the targets, but especially on an offense that is going to be led by Anthony Richardson, potentially lower pass volume. What are you going to do for me efficiency wise? Are you going to be able to turn upfield? Are you going to be able to just have that efficient play that is going to move the needle in fantasy football? And for me with Pittman, I'm a little lukewarm on that.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Like I'm looking at two guys who, right, like this list of 100 plus routes and like sorted by all that. Like Chris Godwin and Michael Pittman are right next to each other in terms of first downs per route run. Like what's the difference between Chris Godwin and Michael Pittman as players? I really don't think there's that big of a difference. And by the way, like that's not negative to Pittman. That's actually like I think Chris Godwin, who we talked about a couple episodes ago here on the podcast, like he's a guy that I think is really kind of gone underrated at this point. He just didn't have the touchdowns last year. He played across from a Mike Evans, who obviously had a great season. Like these are the type of players. I guess we could put it this way. Ryan, if we see these players who are possession merchants, like does Deontay Johnson count as a possession merchant? Because that was another name that came to my mind. Like these guys who are going to be, if they're going to be in an environment where they can be fed targets, like even if the offense isn't great, like the Colts offense wasn't good last year. It wasn't an efficient offense from a success rate, EPA standpoint, anything like that. But it was well designed. It was well constructed. They just had freaking Gardner Minshew at quarterback. Well, like if there's a circumstance where this player can dominate targets, they kind of almost like need that high volume to create a high ceiling, even if they're like a different type of player.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, Deontay Johnson definitely does qualify. He even more first downs per route run than Pittman last year, but was just under 2 yards per route run. So yeah, he certainly stylistically qualifies. I believe fell into like my official statistical bucket at least once over the past 2 years. So yeah, that is the type where, yeah, in these PPR leagues, if they're going to get a ton of volume like Diontae Johnson might this year, then yeah, that can absolutely work out. I can get excited about it. Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm seeing a few others just like kind of on the on your graph here that are minimum. You have minimum 300 routes here, so it's even like better sample size of like good receivers. Like some of these guys that are on that sign of like being more slanted towards the first downs per route run, like Drake London is up there. I think he's definitely in a situation where he could dominate targets. So his yards per route run is fine too. But like that makes so much sense to me. There are guys that like Calvin Ridley's up there. I think that actually makes a lot of sense too when I think about him as a player, just in terms of that grouping there that's good in yards per route run, but I think even shows kind of higher in the first downs per route run. Interesting, just some of the players that are on the other side of it, the big play merchants, which again we'll talk about it in the second half of the show here in just a minute. Any other examples, kind of high level takeaways with first downs per route run and why it matters?
No, I mean that's really it. Yeah. So I mean, just to kind of conclude and sum it all up, like as you said, I want to be really clear as well. I think yards per route run itself is an awesome stat. I use it all the time, of course, but really, yeah, if it has one weakness, it overrates like the one-dimensional deep threat types. And sometimes even like the low ADOT guys that will get a lot of short gains and not move the chains. But really, especially the one-dimensional deep threats. So just having first downs per route run also in your arsenal, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, and I think it can get us into trouble sometimes when we're looking at these small sample size players. Like Rashad Bateman's a great example. Another guy I really like, Khalil Shakir, is a little bit more slanted towards yards per route run than first downs per route run. Although he's in a solid sort of grouping there. Josh Downs, another one I like that he's definitely looks good from a yards per route run standpoint. But like, what's the ceiling of a Josh Downs, right? If that volume's not consistently there, and is he like a true big play threat? I think that's what's interesting when we talk about like wide receiver types. We think about big play merchants as kind of like the George Pickens type, which, spoiler, we're talking about George Pickens here in just a second. That's who we think about as like typical big play merchant. And I guess like final thought on this, Ryan, is it safer to say that like the possession merchants maybe have a higher floor because we can kind of project their skill sets better, but they need a lot of volume to reach that ceiling, whereas like the big play merchants are just more volatile? Like if we're talking about just like brass tacks, let's have a mission statement for people to say after this. Is that sort of like fair, or is it too simplistic?
No, I think that's very fair. Yeah. The possession merchants, we more so know what they are. As long as you have a decent route sample, it's okay. This is a guy that is going to go out and win on his routes in this way. With the big play merchants, there's usually something else going on that just demands further investigation.
Yeah, and I almost think in a way too that like if I could add one thing to that like I almost think the possession merchants are in a way like more insulated from shitty offensive environments. And I'm specifically thinking about like Michael Pittman with the Colts last year, Diontae Johnson with the Steelers, over the course of like his time there, right? Mostly 21 and 20 and 21, right? When Big Ben's kind of falling apart. Like you need a reasonable quarterback. Like Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph, not reasonable quarterbacks, especially Kenny Pickett. I mean, my God, not a reasonable quarterback at all. But like Big Ben at the end of his career, for all the crap that he caught, he was still like a reasonably decent NFL quarterback, just towards the lower end. Gardner Minshew, who I am extremely hard on, Gardner Minshew, I think he's just like fine backup, but like reasonable quarterback play in a rough environment. These guys can still produce, these possession merchants, because they're all like, especially if they're consistent separators, which I think Diontae Johnson and Michael Pittman are both consistent separators. So I think we kind of have a good table set here for why first downs per route run matters and sort of the lexicon in terms of the big play merchants, the possession merchants. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to put this information to use, and we're going to do a little bit of projecting for players in 2024 right after this. All right, we're back. let's apply all this research, Ryan, with first downs per route run to break down specific player situations for 2024. Let's start off with some guys who show out well in this metric and this sort of evaluation process. And let's start with a guy who has been kind of like the talk of fantasy Twitter a little bit the last few weeks. Let's talk about Dontayvion Wicks. And I will say this as we go into it, Ryan, I am one of the Dontayvion Wicks bros. Okay. I'm very into Wicks. I think he's a really good player. So tell us why he makes this list from a positive standpoint.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, I'm a Dontayvion Wicks bro as well, so that we
good company.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, with Wicks, he had the 13th best first downs per route run of any wide receiver last year. So that's immediately going to get your attention. I have personally done a lot of work on age curves for wide receivers, which basically the long and short of that is most wide receivers break out within their first 3 seasons. Year 2 is a very frequent breakout season for wide receivers. So whenever I see a rookie receiver who is ranking in the top 15 of a really predictive stat, I get excited and I say, okay, I probably should become a little more familiar with this guy's game, right? So just for some stats with Wicks, he only ran a 50% route share in 7 games as a rookie. In those games, averaged 37 receiving yards per game, just over 9 PPR fantasy points per game. Both of those marks were actually better than Jackson Smith-Njigba was last year. So, and not that Jackson Smith-Njigba was amazing, but to give you an idea, yeah, like this day 3 wide receiver is stepping in mostly in games that Christian Watson is out of, going and winning on the outside and producing first downs at one of the highest rates in the league. So that's certainly worth paying attention to. I will say 2 months ago, I was very excited about Dontayvion Wicks at cost because it felt like no one was really talking about him. Now you're paying like 2nd round picks in dynasty leagues for him. He's running up the boards in underdog drafts. I think Wicks is going to be an awesome final round pick in most regular redraft fantasy leagues. I do wonder if we're getting a little bit excited super early as a community about him. But this is a situation I really like as well. Ambiguity in this wide receiver core I see as a positive. There isn't really an established alpha here. We will talk about Jayden Reed a little bit later, but I'm not really convinced that anyone here is the clear number 1 wide receiver. We know it's a young quarterback that has shown promise. This is likely to be a good offense again this year. So yeah, this is the type of bet I want to make on a year 2 wide receiver that has shown out in efficiency stats and has a lot of ambiguity in a situation.
Yeah, I kind of want to save the how do the Packers sort out their wide receiver room discussion for when we talk about Jayden Reed in just a second. Because like I think the big takeaway here is that like Dontayvion Wicks is good. He's good at football. Like from a reception perception standpoint, he checks a ton of boxes I look for. Like if you're talking like simple, what do you want to know about reception perception? Guys is over 70% success rate and he plays on the outside. Like we're interested in that player. That Dontayvion Wicks checks that box. And like when you actually dig into some of the specific routes he's good on, like dig routes, working over the middle of the field, they're so critical to this offense. Yeah, it's starting to look like a guy we should be really interested in. And like I know what people are going to say this like, and I'm sure there's some Twitter bros who are like just trying to catch the algorithm wave and want to go viral with their latest Dontayvion Wicks trend. But like, trust me, people who watch film have been talking about Wicks like since the season, and it's important that he shows up in metrics like this. And like just for comparison's sake, Dontayvion Wicks among players who ran 100 routes last year is 18th in yards per route run. Tank Dell is 17th. When you look at first downs per route run, Tank Dell is 14th. Dontayvion Wicks is 13th. Ryan, then you look at early best ball ADP. You know, Tank Dell is the 54th player off the board, and Dontayvion Wicks is the 157th off the board. I know the situations are not the same, but it's still like a crowded receiver room. It's definitely crowded in Houston, probably even more so from a quality standpoint. Again, our guy Nico Collins just signs a big extension today. They have Stephon Diggs. Like, that's a crowded receiver room at the top. The Packers is like crowded from a spread out standpoint. And they look very similar from these metric standpoints, and they don't quite play the same way. But again, Tank Dell also checks that reception perception box of like an outside receiver who wins man coverage over 70%. So it's just like, yeah, I'm with you that we could be getting a little over our skis with Dontayvion Wicks if the hype goes too far. But there's a reason that the hype is there, and like a 100 gap in the ADP of these two players who are tethered to good ascending quarterbacks maybe is not quite justified.
Absolutely, yeah. And I should say, me sitting here at the end of May and saying the hype has gone too far on a player is like the most online, like, sicko
yes.
fantasy take ever. Like, zero people in your home league have heard of Dontayvion Wicks or are being influenced by the Dontayvion Wicks hype. So yeah, I got to keep that in mind a little bit with myself. And I don't know. Sometimes I'm too much of a contrarian for my own good. That's probably the case with Dontayvion Wicks. I should probably just keep paying up for him.
No, dude, you're fine. I mean, I said on the last episode of this show that, like, for all the people like, I'm sick of Jameson Williams. Like, dude, if you're sick of Jameson Williams, like, stop consuming fantasy content for 2 weeks, okay? Like, because nobody else is talking about Jameson Williams like this, and he's a player in his third year, okay? So yeah, it's very much like if you think things have gone too far, sometimes you just need take a little break from content. Not this podcast. Don't take a break from this podcast, but just all the others, tune out for a couple weeks and you'll be fine. Let's talk about Rashee Rice, another second-year player who we mentioned earlier shows up really well in first downs per route run. He's 10th among players that ran 100-plus routes last year. Obviously, it's a tough situation to talk about with Rashee Rice because he is, the legal stuff off the field, the whole deal. We don't know if and when he will be suspended, but just from an on-field standpoint, this is a guy that definitely from this metric standpoint really looks good.
Absolutely, yeah. So Rashee Rice, 10th best in first downs per out run, also 10th best in yards per out run. So that was kind of my immediate thought of Rashee Rice before I did this analysis was, he's probably going to be more of a possession merchanty type. He's had that really low ADOT, kind of a lot of Mickey Mouse stuff, screens, all of that in his rookie season. But yes, that did happen. He did produce a lot on those types of routes. But part of that is just the Chiefs' offense. 65% of Patrick Mahomes' attempts last year came within 9 yards of the line of scrimmage. The Chiefs were facing 2 high safeties at a top 10 rate in the league. And Mahomes' average depth of target overall was the 3rd lowest among 33 qualifying quarterbacks. So part of why Rashee Rice's role was this close to the line of scrimmage stuff is that was the offense the Chiefs kind of set out to run last year. We can read between the lines on that, even going back to them all talking up Kadarius Toney the entire offseason. Is he's going to play such a big role in our offense? Rashee Rice came in and just kicked Kadarius Toney out of that role. And it turned out it was not only was it valuable for fantasy, but Rice also succeeded outside of that role. In first downs per route run from out wide, only Puka Nacua and Dontayvion Wicks were better than Rice out wide among rookies. So I really like betting on talented players when their ADP does not reflect that talent. I understand there's a lot of off the field risk with Rashee Rice, but look, if he is suspended for 6 games, the first 6 games of your fantasy season are the least important 6 games of the fantasy season. If you could pick any week for a player to average 20 fantasy points per game, if I can give you any 4-week stretch, you're picking the end of the year every single time. You're picking the playoffs. Those are the weeks that matter the most in fantasy football. You can get to the playoffs without exceptional performances. And you certainly, with Rice's ADP right now being in the 40s at the wide receiver position, you can get to the playoffs without his help. But like he did last year, when he finally started running over a 60% route share, he was averaging 80 receiving yards per game down the stretch, 17 fantasy points per game down the stretch. Both of those were top 12 numbers. I understand there's more competition, but With Rice, we have seen him do it in this offense on an NFL football field. We can't say that about any of these other Chiefs receivers, aside from Travis Kelce, if we count him, I suppose. So Rice is my favorite Chiefs receiver to draft right now at cost.
Yeah, it's interesting because you bring up the point about like you should be able to survive 6 weeks without Rashee Rice, especially where he's going to end up going. Like right now in consensus ADP in best ball drafts, he's the 64th player off the board. If he does eventually get like a full 6-game suspension, that's probably going to plummet to, like I'd guess maybe the hundreds, right? Like he ends up falling quite a bit. If you just look at him from a first downs per route run standpoint, he's right behind like CeeDee Lamb and Puka Nacua. If CeeDee Lamb or Puka Nacua was suspended for 6 games, there's no way they'd go that low. Like you'd still have to kind of pay the iron price to like, if CeeDee Lamb suspended for 6 games, like, by the way, the Cowboys offense would be beyond effed if the CeeDee Lamb was going to miss 6 games. Sorry, producer Colin, beyond effed. Like you'd still have to probably take him like where Rashee Rice is going right now. Because CeeDee Lamb is that good. And like, I think CeeDee Lamb and Puka Nacua are much better football players than Rashee Rice. Like they have a much wider skill set than Rashee Rice. But I do think where he wins and like what he did last year, there's some of the yak stuff, right, that we're saying maybe is a little bit unsustainable, but that role I don't think is going to change. Like if they had brought in different types of receivers, like maybe there could be somebody to take that yak role, the crossing routes and stuff like that, and they'll use Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy to do that, but those are two very different type of players. So I think his role is pretty insulated on this Chiefs offense right now.
Yeah, completely agree. I had the exact same reaction to the Marquise Brown signing and caught some flack for it on Twitter. At the time, that was before the Rashee Rice stuff, the legal stuff had come out. When Rice was being drafted as a fringe top 12 receiver in early best ball drafts. But yeah, just the fact that was happening and where very sharp people on Underdog were saying, yes, this is where I would like to draft this profile. And now it's the same exact profile from his rookie season. I'm not personally super convinced that Marquise Brown or Xavier Worthy are big threats to the role when Rice is on the field. So yeah, I just really, really want to make that bet. I'm all about the Scott Barrett ethos of upside wins championships. Every draft pick I am making in fantasy football is with the understanding that most fantasy picks, a fantasy pick can win you your league, very few can lose you your league, excuse me. So that's what it is really about with Rashee Rice. I don't care if the 4th or 5th wide receiver I draft on my team is going to not give me much.
Yeah, I will say he's the one name that I'm the most skeptical of on this list, just because I do think it's a very narrow skill set. It reminds me a little bit of Christian Watson last year, who we'll probably talk about when we talk about like some of these other receivers, where he was 11th in yards per route run, 16th in first downs per route run, minimum 100 routes among guys in 2022 was Christian Watson. And like, I know there's injuries and stuff like that, but I also think there's some skill set questions with Christian Watson that has also made him a bit of a volatile player. But the thing with Rashee Rice is that he is so just insulated from a role perspective, and there's Patrick Mahomes obviously involved in that with this. So I will say he's the one name I'm the most skeptical of in terms of where he's checking out in both of these metrics. But I do think from a role perspective, that's the biggest thing that I'm still interested in Rashee Rice. Let's talk Jaylen Waddle. Last one here. We'll talk positive because I actually think the guys who don't show out well, or maybe the big play merchants are the more interesting ones. So Jaylen Waddle, how does he find his way on this list?
Yeah, so he was the 6th best wide receiver in first downs per route run last year, also top 5 in yards per route run. Anytime you get into the per route metrics with Jaylen Waddle, it's going to blow your face away. And that's because he's awesome. Look, why did it feel disappointing to have Jaylen Waddle on your fantasy team last year? Really 2 reasons. One is that he only went over a 70% route share in 6 games last year. that was because he kind of was getting knocked out of a lot of games early with all these minor injuries. There were a few games early in the season after he'd had a concussion where it seemed like the Dolphins were being really cautious after the whole Tua experience the year prior, just with that how much they're going to push these guys to come back from head injuries. So yeah, as it came down to it, we really only had 6 really full games out of Jaylen Waddle. In those 6 games, he averaged 17 and a half fantasy points per game. That would have ranked 7th best, and 83 receiving yards per game. That would have been 10th best. So I understand Jaylen Waddle didn't feel like having a wide receiver 1 on your team last year, but whenever he wasn't having all these weird kind of unlucky things happen to him, he was that. And I mean, Waddle just has an extremely long track record of hyper efficiency as well, even going back to his college career. His first 2 seasons were back-to-back top 5 finishes in yards per out run in the NFL. He was incredible in Scott Barrett's favorite metric that he always makes me shout out, which is depth adjusted yards per target over expected.
You don't have to do it on this podcast. You don't have to do anything that Scott Barrett makes you do. Okay, let's just be super clear about that.
Of course, yes. But yeah, so basically Jaylen Waddle on a per route basis, on a per anything basis, Jaylen Waddle is just unbelievable. The other reason he didn't feel great to have in fantasy last year was really just touchdown luck. So over the past 3 seasons, wide receivers have scored a touchdown for every 166 receiving yards on average. For Waddle last year, that ratio was 1 touchdown for every 254 receiving yards. And this is on the Miami Dolphins. This is on one of the premier passing offenses in the NFL. He just kind of ran cold on touchdowns, and that's really all there is to it. Now he is significantly cheaper. I want to draft a lot of Jaylen Waddle this year.
Yeah, current ADP for him in consensus best ball ADP over on Fantasy Pros is wide receiver 20, 35th overall player. Yeah, I think he's an interesting guy to consider because I've like not been able to get this out of my head, Ryan, just like how disappointing some of these like 1B receivers were last year. Devontae Smith, Jaylen Waddle. I think you can even group in like a Chris Godwin in this, right? Like T. Higgins, although he obviously dealt with injuries and quarterback play and stuff like that. And I've been kind of struggling with like even just my thought about these guys as players, like, because I think it's so easy and so kind of convenient to say, well, yeah, on any other team, he would be a number 1 receiver, but like, he's not going to be the number 1 receiver as long as Tyreek Hill is like squarely in his prime. Same with Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. Same with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Probably same with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, right? And I think that's the hard part about this. Like, is there anything to that type of like kind of, but I understand obviously from a fantasy perspective, right? It's Jaylen Waddle's in a good offense and like he should dominate targets there because I love Malik Washington, but like that guy might be their 3rd receiver this year. He's a 6th round rookie out of UVA. So I from a fantasy perspective, maybe it doesn't matter, but I don't know. That part of it I just can't really get out of my head.
I mean, I agree with you, but unfortunately, this is kind of the NFL we're living in right now. So
yeah,
I was tweeting about this earlier today. Last year, 1/3 of the top 24 fantasy wide receivers came from just 4 teams last year. That was the Rams, the Niners, the Dolphins, and the other one's probably super obvious, but is completely over my head right now. But either way, that's kind of how all of these teams are building their offenses, or at least the efficient passing offenses. That's how they're all building their offenses. So yeah, while I agree, you wish he was the number 1 receiver. That would be nice, but there aren't that many guys you can even say that about. You just listed off 3 other examples where we have these pairs of receivers. The Texans have 3 really good receivers this year that we don't know what to do with. So that I just looking up and down the board in ADP, there are not really that many wide receivers who you can say, okay, they're all alone in their offenses. And the ones who are, that it's almost not a good thing. Like Devontae Adams, sure, he's the clear alpha on the Raiders. Great. Well, like Chris Olave, is Derek Carr going to finally throw downfield to him in an accurate manner? So I get it. Yeah. But I think you have to understand that the smart teams that have the good quarterbacks that can take advantage of a really talented wide receiver, they very often think to themselves, hey, it'd be pretty cool if we had a second guy here too. And it's understandable from an NFL perspective. It makes our job harder. But especially this year, I don't want that to be the only reason that I'm going to run away from a guy, because then I have to run away from all the best offenses in the league. And that doesn't seem like a winning strategy in fantasy football.
No, man. I mean, that's a great point to this. And probably what I would have said going into last year is like, well, the fact that they have all these good pass catchers, it just creates more buoyancy in the offense. It creates more scoring opportunities. It creates better offensive ecosystems. And like, those are the teams we should want to be drafting in. And just like, we're looking at, this is always what we're doing with fantasy football, with football. We're looking at small sample sizes and trying to draw big conclusions. And that's kind of why I posed the question. I'm sure you will not be the last person. You're not the first person that I posed this question to on this podcast, because it's something I'm really struggling with. Because I will say this, if you want to go with like kind of your thought on this, like you look at ADP last year, like all of these 1B receivers were really pushed up the board. This year, they're not. This year they're not. Waddle is 20 off the board in terms of wide receivers. Devontae Smith 23. T Higgins friggin' 27. So yeah, man, it's like you're getting a discount potentially on these players if everything hits. But all right, let's talk negative here, Ryan Heath. Let's talk about the players, maybe some of these big play merchants, guys who don't show out as well in this process. And let's go back to the Packers and let's talk about Jayden Reed, because it's funny, like, when you first send me the list of guys you wanted to talk about, when I first read your article and I look at big play merchants, like I was almost like, and I shared the list with producer Colin, and he was like, what's Jayden Reed doing here? Like some of these other names we're talking about, like very understandable why they're a big play merchant, but tell us why Jayden Reed sort of shows up as a big play merchant and maybe some of the concerns about him going into year two. And just for clarity's sake, for full transparency, I love Jayden Reed, was a big fan of him as a prospect, but I think we're actually going to have kind of some similar thoughts here about like the usage. So take it away, Ryan.
Yeah. So I'm not totally sure that Reed fits into like the stylistic archetype necessarily of, oh, like he's this burner on the outside or whatever, that it is going to be an inconsistent big play threat. That's not really what he is. So maybe the label is a bit of a misnomer. But I do think it at least tells us something, that over the past 3 years of all wide receiver seasons, Jayden Reed's yards per route run was 87th percentile. So first of all, that's great. Jayden Reed had a really good rookie season. Not to take that away from him. He's probably really good. But first downs per route run, just 73rd percentile. Still pretty good, but it at least hints that there was something going on here where he's producing above the yards above and beyond his consistent first down production. So I mean, I have a few thoughts here and a few concerns. So one thing I immediately noticed with Jayden Reed, just kind of digging through the Fantasy Points data suite, is that over 20% of his targets were design targets on design plays. We have this as a charted stat in the Fantasy Points data suite. That was the sixth most of any wide receiver last year, and was more than double the average, essentially. So, and you can say, okay, well, same thing with Rashee Rice. Why do we care? We didn't see Jayden Reed go and win on the outside at any point in his rookie season. In weeks 5 through 11, when all of the Packers' top 4 wide receivers were healthy, all of Christian Watson, Dontayvion Wicks, Romeo Doubs ran over 70% of their routes outside. Reed was in the slot 81% of the time. And that over the whole season, he was in the slot the 6th most of any wide receiver. So, yes, slot wide receivers can be successful in fantasy football. That's fine. I would never argue otherwise. But look, what we know from him being a big play merchant is it's not super likely that he's going to be more efficient next year, right? So for Jayden Reed to really take that next step forward, if it can't be on efficiency, it needs to be just on route volume, right? And that's going to be difficult if he's stuck in the slot. And if a player like Romeo Doubs is keeping him out of these 2 wide receiver sets. So that's kind of my nitpicky concern with Jayden Reed. I don't hate him at ADP or in Dynasty or anything like that. But I just think with him being the highest priced of all these Packers wide receivers, that price doesn't reflect my conviction in, is Jayden Reed going to be the guy who really emerges from this skill core?
Yeah, and it's highest priced with a little bit of a gap too. That's the thing, right? Where he's wide receiver 33 and Christian Watson's wide receiver 44. You get to Dobbs at 52, and we mentioned Dontayvion Wicks all the way down there at wide receiver 69. Like, there's a pretty decent gap from all the other guys up there to Jayden Reed, and I think that's where sort of the hesitation has to come in because, man, like I said, I love Jayden Reed, but I do think this is a pretty packed receiver core overall, and like I similarly struggle with finding conviction on these players just because, like, I don't know what the Packers think about these guys. Like, it's one thing to, let's tell you what I think. Like, and this is, just one part of it. I think that Jayden Reed, there is nothing about his film when I watch him that says like, oh, and chart him, his RP success rate, stuff like that. There's nothing that says he can't play like flanker in 2 receiver sets. Okay. Like, and in my opinion, if they run out the first 4 weeks and it's like Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson in 2 receiver sets and like Jayden Reed's like kind of a part-time player, I bet you Packers fans by week 4 are like, what are we doing? Like, why is Jayden Reed not on the field more than these guys? But that's my opinion. I will tell you from, like, if you want to fade my opinion, I've had the same thought about like Curtis Samuel and Elijah Moore. These guys that like, why can't their route running's good? Like, they separate against man coverage. Like, why can't they play in kind of a full field receiver role? And then coaching staffs kind of just like pigeonhole them. And again, my opinion, pigeonhole them in these roles. And then they never really have that fantasy season that we're imagining. So for me, it's like my concern with Reed is nothing to do with him as a player, but it is this role in this receiver room. Cause like, yeah, I'm also the guy sitting here saying like, they got to find ways to get Dontayvion Wicks on the field. And like, I don't think Christian Watson stinks. I think he is definitely an incomplete and a volatile player. Like he to me, even though the stats don't bear it out, like to me, I think he is a bit of a big play merchant just from like a stylistic standpoint, but like you still want that guy in the field because he makes plays like, and he brings value to the team. So, and Romeo Doubs, I don't know. Romeo Doubs is a little bit of just kind of a snaps eater, but he has these big games. So it's hard to say that after he was the most important player for them in the playoffs. So like, even though I have conviction on Jayden Reed as a player, Ryan, I think a lot of your metrics point why we can't go completely all in on Jayden Reed, even if we like the player.
Yeah, I agree. And on Dobbs, I meant to say this earlier, but I'm glad I saved it till now. Romeo Dobbs did qualify as a possession merchant actually last year. So
it checks out.
But I mean, when we talk about what a coaching staff is going to care about, yes, I agree with you. I feel like we do see this frequently where a guy gets to the NFL level, he's typecast into a specific role, and even subsequent coaching staffs will just keep him in that same role. A lot of coaches do not seem willing to experiment with players. And yeah, as fantasy managers, we have to understand that and predict that and know that is most often what happens, unfortunately. But yeah, for me, as I said, it's if Jayden Reed is, and I agree, Jayden Reed's really good, but yeah, I would just really like him to get Romeo Doubs off the field. But yeah. I mean, maybe the Packers coaching staff is like, yeah, we like Romeo Doubs. He gets us the first downs and he moves the chains, and that's hard to argue with. So yeah, that's kind of my full, I guess, have laid out my full thoughts like on the Packers receiver core today. But yeah, I'm drafting all of them aside from Dobbs. But yeah, just the price of these guys and the difference between them, I don't think should be as wide as it currently is.
If Dobbs was like 10% worse of a player, I'd be fully like, yeah, just get him. You just don't need this guy on the field. He's like just good enough that I can understand why a coaching staff is still having him out there, even if to me he's clearly the 4th best in this room. But yeah, it'll be interesting. That's a room that's going to be tough to have conviction on, even if I have conviction on the players, just because it's so crowded. And by the way, they have 2 good pass catching tight ends. It's always worth noting that. Okay, let's talk about a guy who I think it's 0% surprising that he shows up on this list. Because like I'm just looking at guys like there's a 20% difference between, there's a 20 spot difference between their yards per route run percentile and first downs per route run percentile. There's a few like very obvious names, like the fact that Josh Palmer is a big play merchant. I mean, that alone, buddy, you should take a little like victory lap on this metric. So he's there. Rashid Shaheed is there. 100% makes sense, right? Darius Slayton, he's a 20 spot difference. Jerry Jeudy, I mean, again, another one. Like I'm having you on this podcast simply because that validates my Jerry Jeudy thoughts over the course of his career. Like a lot, Marvin Mims. I mean, for God's sakes, Marvin Mims was a 43 spot difference. Totally makes sense. A lot of these make sense. I think for some people, the fact that George Pickens is in this over 20 spot difference group would be surprising because he did have a nice yards per route run result last year. But I think first downs per route run sort of shows some of the questions that we should have about Pickens as a player, even if we can all admit he's one of the most exciting receivers in the league.
Absolutely, yeah. So 88th percentile yards per out run for George Pickens last year, just 62nd percentile in first downs per out run. And kind of how this happened it feels very clear to me. So back in college, in Pickens' 2 seasons where he saw more than one target, he averaged just over 3 yards after the catch per reception. He has never been a yak guy at all. As a rookie in the NFL, just 2.3 yards after the catch per reception. That was bottom 5 among all wide receivers. George Pickens, it is the make the sit contested catch and then fall down type of receiver. Then last year, Pickens averaged 6.6 yards after the catch per reception. Yeah. And that ranked top 10 in the league. And that was a lot of what was driving his really, really high yards per out run. So I look at that and just knowing how not stable yards after the catch is for most players, and adding in that it's George Pickens, who we had a pretty big sample size to say this is not the yak type of player. Just seeing all that, I immediately want to say, okay, this yak is regressing next year. He cannot be this efficient just in terms of yards in the following season. So he is just a very clear regression candidate to me, just in terms of his yards per out run. And then, I mean, we add in what this offense is likely to look like. I mean, look, Drake London as a rookie had a 28% target share in an Arthur Smith offense, right? He averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game. Pickens in his entire career has never gone over a 21% target share. We don't even know that George Pickens can command an alpha target share. We've never seen it happen. Yes, he has been competing with Deontay Johnson his entire NFL career, but I still don't want to take that leap of faith into an extremely low volume offense where the efficiency is likely to come down for him as a player. So I just have never been a George Pickens person whatsoever. And I scare myself with this a little bit, just that I'm confirmation biasing myself. But yeah, I just have trouble finding good signs for George Pickens this year.
Man, he is a tough player. And I always say that he's like one of the receivers you just like can't have a normal conversation about, because like there's a handful of people that think he's absolute trash, like can't separate it all, to total not a good player. And then there's like a sect of people that think he's like secretly an elite receiver, and you all are just too stupid to know it. Like watch the games, bro. Like look at the catches, bro. And you know, the truth is somewhere in the middle there. Okay, because it's neither extreme. I'll tell you that. And like he's just a tough player to get a handle on, even when you watch him. Like I just don't know how you can. I just don't know how, to me it's always tough to think like that type of player, somebody in like kind of the Mike Williams archetype, is going to be like a consistent number one receiver for a team. Like I need him to be more of a consistent separator. He's not terrible. He's not even like super far below average. It's just like that archetype of receiver lends itself to volatility. And then there's obviously some of these metrics that you point out too about the yards after the catch stuff. Yeah, and some of those plays, his yards per hour run is definitely inflated by some yak plays, and it's difficult, man, because like on some of the yak plays he looks really good, but you're right that we have a history of him as a player. So and that's before we even talk about we're betting on the Arthur Smith volume, the Russell Wilson Justin Fields effect. Like I don't know. He's not going terribly high in drafts. He's wide receiver 30. Like, I don't think that's all that offensive. It's just he's a tough guy to get a handle on, is George Pickens. And this, I think, data really shows why that's the case. We got two more receivers to talk about here. Let's talk Jordan Addison here really quickly, because I think he's another one that some people might be surprised turned out to be a little bit of a big play merchant. But again, he's another player when you actually watch him, I think it does make sense.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and I should say before Addison, you might notice there are a lot of second-year players showing up on this list. Yes, I normally am all about the second-year players, but when I find a reason to question their profile, especially if their ADP has been lifted up expecting a second-year breakout, that's something I'm going to pay attention to and know, right? So with Jordan Addison, him being a big play merchant, we know that about 85% of the time, he's not going to be more efficient next year. He's likely to be less efficient next year. So we have to look at Addison and say, okay, how could he break out while being less efficient? And the fact is, last year, he ran the 9th most total routes of any wide receiver. And the Vikings volume is not likely to be as insane as it was through the air that it was with Kirk Cousins. So, and I mean, Addison, even just his yards per out run was kind of mediocre, only 1.6. So I just already not a profile I'm excited about, seeing some holes to dig in it. He also had kind of a crazy touchdown season, right? This is from Derek Brown on Twitter, kind of summed this up very, very well a couple of days ago. 15th in end zone targets last year among all wide receivers, tied for the 4th most receiving touchdowns, behind only Mike Evans, Tyreek Hill, and CeeDee Lamb. So definitely swinging above his weight class in terms of scoring efficiency. But yeah, I mean, he's outside the top 50 in all of these per route stats we care about, just 46th in target share. He came in and he benefited certainly from this high volume offensive environment that the Vikings had going on last year. That won't necessarily be the case again. Yes, TJ Hawkinson being out likely for part of the season should help some, but he's going to come back. He is going to command targets away from Addison down the stretch run of the season. Justin Jefferson being out for a lot of last year helped Jordan Addison get more targets and make more big plays as well. And that's not the case now. So yeah, I just have trouble getting excited about Addison, and this is one reason why.
Yeah, Addison is just like, he just looks like a regular old number 2 receiver in the league when you look at him from a reception perception standpoint. And, you know, you think about just like some of those 1B receivers we talked about in the top, like he's not even close to like Devontae Smith or Jaylen Waddle or, you know, Chris Godwin or T. Higgins or any of these guys. Like he's several tiers below. So he's definitely worth being concerned about. It's funny, Josh Downs, who shows up as a big play merchant here. And I love Josh Downs, big Josh Downs fan. Tough to talk about for fantasy just because volume and the Anthony Richardson stuff. And like they draft Eddie Mitchell, whatever. But like he looks very similar to Jordan Addison here. And like, I don't think those guys usually get grouped in the same way, but like, I would argue that Josh Downs is an even better player than Jordan Addison. So Addison's definitely going to be a tough click. I hate that we saved this guy for an hour and plus into the podcast because Jameson Williams, who shows up as a big play merchant, I don't think that's surprising at all, Ryan. I did not know, Ryan, that Jameson Williams is actually the most important player in the NFL. But dude, based on like anytime I talk about this guy on social media, even my Discord, which is generally like one of the most pleasant places on the internet, erupts into like days long's worth of debate after I posted his reception perception sample. Like, hey, little hint to the editors, to the producers, like make segments about Jameson Williams this offseason. They're going to click, baby. Jameson Williams is getting you clicks, okay? Because apparently, Ryan, he's the most important player in the NFL this season. So I'm an idiot. This is why, you know, I'm not a producer. I'm an idiot for saving him until over an hour into the show because people clearly want to hear about him. But he, I think, unsurprisingly, does show up as a little bit of a big play merchant for your metrics here, Ryan. I just like, I think overall, like my question to you is just how do we like, what is Jameson Williams? And like, how do we square with like the fact that he just has not at all had a normal career? Like, how do we evaluate him even through the process of like yards per route run versus first downs per route run?
Sure. So yeah, Jameson Williams yards per route run last year, 53rd percentile. That's fairly respectable, considering that he kind of came in partway through the year, has had a lot of things that he's dealt with so far in his career. But first downs per route run, just 35th percentile, outside the top 70. So yeah, Jameson Williams, it is the perfect example of a big play merchant. Literally half of his receiving yards last year came on exactly 4 plays. So when I talk about a few big
assume,
plays,
by the way, I just for clarity's sake, I assume this is just for the regular season when you mentioned that.
In the regular season. Yes. So yeah, and I mean, that was enough to make his yards per route run look respectable, pumps it up. But we look at first downs per route run, we say, okay, this was anything but a consistent winner on his routes. And then I just look at the stylistic fit with the team and really with his quarterback and what they want to do. Jared Goff threw deep down the field at 20 plus yards down the field at only a 7.3% rate last year. That was the lowest of any quarterback in the league with minimum 250 dropbacks. Williams has never hit 70 receiving yards during any of his 18 career games. I just see this as a player who came into the league with high draft capital and has done kind of not a whole lot in his first 2 seasons. I tend to shy away from those types of profiles. I understand that Dan Campbell comes out with a new unhinged quote about him like every 2 weeks. There was one linked in my article. I think there was a new one today that I saw. Maybe I should be updating that every single week. So yeah, I get why he's polarizing. I get why people are very bought in to Jameson Williams in terms of his success or his failure. But yeah, I am pretty firmly on the side of not only am I not convinced that the player based on the results on the field are what we want for fantasy, just as an archetype, I tend to shy away from these types of guys who don't command a lot of volume. They will stretch the field and they'll be valuable to their teams in real life. They're going to draw coverage and that's great. But it's not what we're looking for in fantasy. We want guys that can command really big target shares, and Jameson Williams hasn't really ever done that.
Yeah, like I've continued to say with Jameson Williams, right now he's wide receiver 48 in early best ball drafts, and he is the 109th player off the board. I think that is totally fine. Okay, like take the shot. Wide receiver 48. Who cares if that doesn't work out for you? You're missing out on the Bills receivers and like Mike Williams with the Jets. If you pass up, James Williams or you take James Williams, who cares? Go ahead and take the shot. Why not? I just think that, as you said perfectly, like the unhinged quotes from Dan Campbell, the just complete optimism, the way that there is some of the community that is just for whatever reason so bought into Jameson Williams, like. I think he could be a 6th-round pick by the time like drafts come around in August, which is going to be alarming. Like that is when this gets concerning. And it's tough because I seriously am going to do like a full podcast episode on Jameson Williams at some point, just because I think like it has to happen. But just like when I look at him, because when I was charting him for perception, just quick spoiler alert, like I did use playoff games. I actually think that sometimes like we forget in fantasy that like playoffs like happen and those matter. Like those games really do matter to talking about certain players, right? Like they don't need to over define the narrative, but for some players, I think like this guy in particular, it's got to matter just because the sample stinks before you get late into the season. Like when I isolated him just from games 15 and on, I actually think he just looked like a solid NFL player. Nothing special, but like solid. Because before that, Ryan, he looked like non-functional in reception perception. But like when I do that same thing for first downs per route run here, I'm looking at in terms of players that ran 100 plus routes from week 15 to the Super Bowl. We've got 82 players that fit here. and Jameson Williams is 41st. He's sandwiched between DJ Chark and Rashad Bateman. What does that do for you? I mean, I think that actually perfectly kind of encapsulates the feelings on Jameson Williams, Ryan, that like you could probably talk yourself in either direction with this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, yeah, super easy to just go ahead and add the playoffs into your sample with the Fantasy Points data suite. That's data.fantasypoints.com. But yeah, I agree. That's kind of a shrug of the shoulders, and that's fine. No, I don't think anyone's going to be at a shrug of the shoulders with Jameson Williams in terms of their disposition this year. Thing. But yeah, that's totally fine. I think that's an understandable take. He is probably a starting NFL wide receiver. Is that the archetype I tend to zero in on in fantasy football? Not really. And that's fine. He can be someone else's cup of tea there, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think my thought with Williams is we're going to get like all the way through. I say right here in May, I don't really have that strong of a take on him as one way or another. I think by the time we get to kickoff, I'm really not going to have that strong of a take, despite the fact that seemingly everybody else has the strongest possible take on Jameson Williams. Well, Ryan, this was the strongest possible podcast that you could have done here, man. I had high expectations for this. You totally crushed it. The information was fantastic. Great kickoff to this series. You're not just like writing about first downs per route run for Fantasy Points. You've actually come up with some great content throughout the course of the offseason. Tell the people what they can check out from you over on Fantasy Points.
Yeah, so this whole offseason, I've been writing a series called Statistically Significant, where I kind of go through all of my favorite stats in the Fantasy Points data suite. I just recently had a big article come out about weighted opportunity that's focusing on running backs. And I did the same thing in that one for a few of the guys where I just throw the playoffs into the sample and can immediately make a much better case for players like Isaiah Pacheco. So I'm with you there. So yeah, go ahead and check that out on fantasypoints.com, or you can find me on X at RyanJ_Heath.
Boom. Definitely make sure you do that. Fantastic stuff from Ryan on this podcast. Absolutely love the information that first downs per route run can give us about wide receivers. Just another piece of the puzzle to my favorite position to study. That is going to do it for this show. We're going to be back on Thursday with Nate Tice making his official debut on this podcast as a full-time member of the team here on Yahoo. You are not going to want to miss that. It's a great continuation to this series. We're going to be a couple dudes talking about the run game and why it matters again. With that, until then, we're out.